Okay, so one of the first things that we're going to have to do when we have our objects is we're going to have to wipe these things off. We wipe them off really quickly, just a slightly damp sponge. I've got a smaller sponge here. You can certainly use a bigger sponge. You don't want the sponge to be soaking wet. You just want the sponge to be a little bit wet. What we're doing here is we're trying to get all the dust off the surface of the piece, all right? When we're doing this also, we don't want to be wearing, we don't want to have freshly lotioned our hands. So when you come to school, don't have any lotion on your hands or anything to do your glazing, all right? We do have bathrooms in the studio as well. So you can use the bathrooms. If you have lotion on your hands, you can wash them off. But you don't want that stuff on there. That lotion will create a resist with the glaze, and then it's going to be a spot where you're not going to get glaze. I got on the inside and I got on the outside. So I'm going to do this to all the objects that I have. And again, I'm kind of running out, like a little bit of that moisture kind of came off mostly for the last one. Came off this sponge, but that's okay. It's not a big deal. I just want to get it mostly off of here, all right? Just get that dust off of there. And that dust is not like dust how we normally think of it, like what we have around our house in terms of dust. The dust that's kind of on here is a little bit light kind of dusting of clay or of the material that we've used, okay? Or maybe, I mean, it hasn't been that long since they came out of the kiln. We just unloaded it the other day. Actually, Sam unloaded most of it. I still have a little bit more to unload. But as it sits out, it can gather dust inside of the studio as it's sitting around. So we want to make sure we get that fine dust layer off of there. What we don't want to do is do this and then let them sit for a couple of days. Once we get back into the studio, if you take intermediate or studio a little bit later, you don't want to like wash these and then set them aside for a week and then come back to them to glaze them. We don't have that much time to glaze. We're only going to have one session here in class to do it. And we'll probably be in about 15 to 20 minute segments where you can come in and do the glazing. We can fit about 4 people in our glaze room. I'm in that glaze room right now, and you can see behind me that we have a bunch of buckets down there. You don't really want to handle them that much any longer either, because you don't want to get the oils from your skin onto those objects either, okay? As you can see, we've got all these containers that are here. They're marked. Some of them are marked on the bottom and the top. Some are just marked on the top. But what I would essentially trust is I would trust what it says on the bucket, not what it says on the lid, okay? This is my first time glazing the studio, so there might be a couple of discrepancies that I'm talking about right now, but I will be here when we're doing this glazing, and so you can ask me any questions, all right? We also have, I'll take you over to it. We also have over here a little bit of a chart too that shows some of the glazes. Some of these are going to be a little bit different, okay? And they're going to be a little bit different because of what, there's a couple that I didn't mention. The only ones that are there that I didn't mention, like the non-iron blue Celadon, I didn't mention that because we don't really have a lot of it right now. And so I didn't want to go over a glaze that you maybe wouldn't have an option, essentially, to use, okay? All right, so here I'm going to be using this one, which is called the Ojada Khaki. We didn't have a test tile or one of those bowl test tiles of this one, so this one's a kind of, it's up here on the board. So if you want to know what it looks like, you can see it up here on the board. It's another big iron glaze, but when we come in here, we've got these paddles, and this is what you want to use to stir the glaze. You want to make sure that this gets stirred really well. These materials that we use, they can stain pretty badly. And this is not mixed up very well. Look at this. You see those chunks kind of flopping off, okay? You want to be careful of that stuff. You want to make sure that you kind of stir this stuff around for a while. And I'm not going super fast. I don't need like any sort of a massive drill to do this. I just want to mix it around from side to side, kind of get down into some of those nooks and crannies down on the bottom of this thing, all right? And then every now and then I'll pick this up and take a look at the end of that paddle and see whether or not it has those chunks or that sludge on it. And if it still has that sludge, that means I need to keep going and keep stirring, okay? Very important that you keep stirring. You don't want part of the glaze settled down at the bottom. If that part of the glaze settles down at the bottom of this object, then that can be a big problem, because that means that some of the heavier materials that are part of the glaze are down at the bottom, and you're not going to get the best consistency of glaze. All right, so we really want to mix these around. Just a little bit more here. All right, that looks pretty good. See, no more sludge, okay? And it's a little bit easier if I take this almost right away over to clean it, or if I'm just gonna be very quick and there's not too many people in here, I can take it and set it on the lid, okay? That way it's not contaminating any of the other glazes. We wanna make sure that it doesn't get into those other glazes. Lots of different ways that we can dip glaze. I can take this and I can hold it by the very bottom like this with a couple of my fingers. And it's okay to get this kind of on your hand. You just don't want your hand to be in there forever, okay? We're gonna go and we're gonna dip that inside, make sure that it gets all the way on the inside, and then we're gonna pull it back out and shake it off like this and hold it upside down as the glaze goes off of it, all right? And we're gonna do that until it looks like it starts to dry. And then once I'm finished, then I'm gonna turn it right side up, and then I can kind of hold on to it this way, okay? The glaze will dry very quickly on the surface, okay? Because this bisque-fired work, it absorbs the moisture very quickly, all right? So this is to dip one piece in one glaze, very quick dip. We spend about 1 second inside of the glaze, and then we're gonna shake it off, okay? We don't wanna get it down in there and hold it down in there for a long period of time. We might get too much glaze on it. If we get too much glaze on our objects, then essentially what can happen is that some of the glaze is gonna run off the clay, right? And it's gonna make a puddle, essentially, on the shelf of our kiln. We're gonna put it on little cookies when we fire them, but still, it's gonna make kind of an unsightly appearance for you guys, for your objects. You wanna get the right consistency. There are 3 super important things for, the most important things for glazing. Consistency, or sorry, strike that. I don't even know why I said that. 3 main things: application, application, application. It's all about how we apply these things, okay? And the reason why I said consistent is you want to be consistent. If you consistently know that if you dip your glaze in a certain way that it's going to come out the way you like it, then that's how you're going to know how to do it, right? But for this class, for the intro class, the beginning class, you only get 1 kind of session of glazing this semester. And if you stay for an intermediate and then move on to later on and end up doing the studio class, then you'll get a little bit more time to kind of understand that and to get that consistency down. But for now, watch how this happens. Ready? Go down inside. Make sure all those little blub, blub, blub come out. Give it some good shakes like this. It is all over my hand right now, okay? That's okay. It's not gonna hurt you. Long-term exposure to this stuff, having it on your skin for a long period of time, that's what can essentially make the difference, right? So now it's mostly dry. I'm gonna take it over here and slide it onto the table. You guys won't be able to see that part of it, okay? And then I've got it all over my hand. I try not to drip it anywhere, but I'm gonna come right over to the sink. And then get my hand washed off. Use one of the sponges that's here to get all that stuff off of your hand. Very simple way of glazing. So this hasn't even been that long, just as long as I was over washing my hand, and now it's completely dry. I can touch it, right? And I can see there's a couple of spots here where I don't have any glaze, and glaze is all over the bottom, right? We don't want glaze all over the bottom. So what we want to do is take a sponge. We've got these here in the studio, and we give it a quick spin, and you can see almost all of it's gone right now, right? We give it a couple quick spins like this, and then I can even turn it over to the other side. And I want to get it off that surface about 1/4 of an inch up, right? You can kind of see that, 1/4 of an inch up. And I got that just by pushing down on this sponge, right? To get 1/4 of an inch up. And there's a little bit of glaze that's right there, but that's far enough up there that that's okay, right? And then I look around here and I see if I've got a little spot like this where, you know, there's some glaze that needs to go there. Let's move us closer. What I can do is come over to this glaze, get a little bit on my finger, and just a little drip, just a little dot right there where that was missing. Just a little dot right there where that was missing. All right? I'm not even really touching the surface. I'm just letting the drip touch the surface when I do that. All right? And that's one glaze onto that object. Double check on the inside. Make sure that you've got glaze on the inside, right? Because that's important, especially on something like a cup or a mug. We want to be able to have that sanitary so we can clean it. All right? And then we've got a dirty sponge. We got a dirty table. We clean up. All right? So I'm just going to wipe this up with my sponge. And I do it as I'm going, right? Don't leave a mess. Clean it up as you're going. All right? And then we go over to the sink, clean the sponge out. All right? Sound good? We got 2 other ways to do it. I'm going to show you those in just a second. All right, so I've cleaned up the paddle, and I'm going to show you guys how to use 2 different glazes, but I'm not necessarily showing you guys this for you guys to use 2 separate glazes on one object necessarily, but we are going to talk about 2 different ways to do it. The first way I'm going to show you guys is how to put glaze on the inside and the outside differently, but more so I'm showing you guys how to do this because several of you guys have taller coil pots. If you have a taller coil pot, you're probably going to need to pour the glaze on the inside to get the inside because some of our buckets or most of our buckets are not big enough. All right? So one thing that we have in the studio for your disposal is we've got some different types of containers that you can use to basically pull some material or scoop some material out and pour it into another spot. We also have just some little cups, okay? This one's a little dirty, so I'm gonna rinse it out really quickly. There we go. And I'm gonna use 2 really different glazes on this, just so we can kind of see the difference between them. So I'm going to be using the eggshell. So I'm going to go ahead and mix up that eggshell, just like we mixed up the last color, okay? We mix it up until we have none of that sludge down below. This one was a little bit easier to mix up. It probably has been, just doesn't settle quite the same as the other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the eggshell first. Get it into my container, whatever that container is, and kind of mop up any of the excess so it doesn't spill all over the floor of the studio. It'll look like nobody does this when you probably come in. The studio's not in the greatest of shape right now, but that's okay, all right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, I'm going to pour it in, and then I'm going to show you a special way to pour it out. I'm going to pour it right back into this container. So I'm going to pour it in there and get it about 3/4 of the way full, at least half full, okay, for some of your larger objects. And then when I take this, I go like this and I spin that cup or that object as I get that out of there. And then give it some good shakes just like we did the last time. all right? And then we get a nice, good consistency on the inside, all right? We want to get those twists in there. We want it, that twist actually gets it so we coat everything on the inside, all right? And if there's anything that's spilled on the table, just like before, you know, we're going to take care of it. This is just eggshell, so it can get poured right back in to the eggshell container. And it's kind of a good practice that in between everything you get that cleaning done, right? So I'm going to clean up these, and I'm going to be right back with you. All right, so now I've already mixed up the Temoku over here. Big thing about when we mix something up and then we go to dip it, we really don't want any more than like a minute to pass before we actually use it. Because if we stir it up and then we wait like 5 minutes, you know, run to the bathroom, come back, some of those heavier materials will fall down in suspension. And there may be a little microscopic version, like little small puddle of water on the top of it that you won't even notice and be able to detect. So what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to dip this. I'm going to take my hand like this, and I'm going to take it and dip it straight down in, all the way up until it gets up towards the rim, all the way around, and then pull it out and give it that shake that we talked about. And what I'll even do is kind of go this way, right? So that way this glaze, as it's cascading down and gravity is working, it's moving this direction and getting up towards the rim. If I get it up towards the rim, then essentially what will happen is if anything runs, it'll run back down this way rather than all being down here. If I dipped it like that and then set it on the table like this, then gravity is just going to pull it all back down, right? And as that gravity pulls it back down, then we're going to be in kind of a world of hurt when it gets into the kiln and fires, because essentially what can happen is you can have too much glaze down on the bottom, and if there's too much glaze down on the bottom, it'll run off, okay? Notice that I haven't overlapped any glazes yet, and I've done that on purpose. I'm going to show you one kind of way where we can overlap a glaze, and I'm going to use two different glazes. I think I'm going to use the Temoku, and then I think I'm going to use also the shiny black if I can find it. Okay, so give me a moment to get myself together, get a couple things stirred, and then we're going to talk about how to kind of overlap glazes. One thing I want to make sure that I did here, I'm looking back at this and making sure I didn't leave any spots unglazed. Anything that's left unglazed will just be unglazed. And an unglazed surface means it's not a very sanitary surface. We don't have that really nice smoothness of the glaze to help it out, okay, and be a sanitary surface. Sound good? All right, so for this one, I'm going to use both the Temoku and the tea dust. They're very similar glazes, but that tea dust has a little bit of those yellow, kind of yellow-green spots on it that give it that name, but they're both high iron glazes. So it's kind of that might be a kind of interesting kind of colors to go for. And one thing we want to think about when we use two glazes is whether or not those two colors are going to go together, and how they're going to go together, right? So if we think about some of our elements and principles of design, the one that I did over there with the Temoku on the outside and the, what did I use? The eggshell on the inside, do those two colors match? Well, they kind of do, because eggshell's white, right? It goes with a lot of things, but what kind of element or principle of design do I have there? Well, what I have is contrast. I have something that's very light and something that's very dark, okay? So contrast could be something that's a good thing to use for choosing what two glazes I'm going to use if I use two glazes at the same time, all right? With these two, this is kind of going to be more monochromatic, right, in terms of the color scheme that I'm using. Because both the Temoku and the tea dust are high iron glazes that give us that really darker blackish kind of red-black color. And the tea dust is just going to have some of those little specks on it, or a lot of specks. And that's the interesting thing about tea dust, is that you kind of never know exactly how many specks you're going to get on your object when you glaze it. It all depends on the atmosphere within the kiln. All the glazes that we use here at Riverside City College that we'll be using this semester all of them are reduction glazes, which means at a certain point in the firing, we reduce the amount of oxygen within the kiln. And when we reduce the amount of oxygen, it changes the way that the glazes look, okay? So that's how we get some of the looks that we get, all right? So the tea dust is nice and stirred. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna hold it sideways. I'm gonna dip it and I'm gonna get kind of an angle here. And I can go halfway, I can go 1/3. It all depends on what I'm looking for, okay? I just want a little bit of the tea dust, so I'm not gonna get a whole ton of the tea dust on here. So I'm just gonna kind of dip a little bit in there, all right? And when I do that, I'm thinking about, you know, 2/3, 1/3, all right? So I got a little bit of a dip on that, okay? You can see it's at an angle. Does it need to be on an angle? No, it can be straight up and down, right? That's up to you as the maker as to whether or not that's how you want it, all right? So now I'm gonna come over here to my Temoku, and I want the Temoku to be the more dominant glaze that's on this. So give it a little stir there, make sure it's ready to go. And then I'm gonna think about how that was held, right? And I'm gonna dip that in, and I'm gonna slightly overlap these, just ever so slightly. And where that overlap happens, okay, where the Temoku goes over top of the tea dust, that's gonna give it a specific look as well. Because this is the Temoku, this is the tea dust. Temoku over tea dust looks different than tea dust over Temoku, right? Of course, I had to use two glazes that started with the letter T to confuse you as much as possible, right? And then one thing I haven't done to this one, and also this other one, is I haven't wiped the bottom, right? It's just like we learned at a very early age, you always wipe your bottom. Differences in ceramics is that we wipe our bottom 1/4 of an inch from the bottom, so that way we can leave and allow room for our glaze to run, all right? And I'm gonna do the same thing to this. And this one, I may actually need to go and get a little bit more water. It's mostly coming off. This, that's not wiping your bottom. You're leaving a whole bunch of stuff down there. And look at how dirty that sponge is, right? Sponge is too dirty. I can't get it any cleaner than that. So maybe I use this really quickly to get some of this off the table. And I go over to the sink and disappear for a second out of sight from you guys so I can use the sink. And you really got to squeeze these things out. Make sure we get as much of it off of there. Now, real big thing here is that I've got a wet hand. If I went and touched that object right now, I would just mar up the surface completely, all right? We'll have some towels for you guys. I got to run over where I have my towel. I don't like to use paper towels in the classroom. They just make a bunch of waste. So we'll have some towels for you guys to use to dry your hands off. And now I can come in here and get back to work. I can actually use this sponge, right? It still has, but look at how much still wipes up off of there. And the way this foot was designed is this foot was designed with a little bit of a glazed trap in it. And it's got this beveled edge right here, and that beveled edge is actually keeping, showing me essentially where that 1/4 of an inch is. I want to get as much of that off of there. There's still going to be a little bit because iron stains a lot. Iron is that material that we have in our blood. That's what causes our blood to stain our clothing, is the iron that's in it. So you got to make sure you get in there, right? I touched that with a dry hand. That's really important. If I went in there, just remember, if I went in there with a very wet finger or wet fingers, then we would have just put a bunch of finger marks on that thing, okay? So, bottom is wiped, 1/4 of an inch up from the bottom. Bottom is wiped, 1/4 of an inch up from the bottom. Notice that that is still glazed inside of there, okay? That's okay. We want that glazed. This piece, 1/4 of an inch from the bottom. Little small button right there, still glazed, that's okay, all right? We don't need to wipe all that off unless for some reason you want to, but it's not necessary, okay? So those are a couple different ways that we're gonna be glazing. The pots look completely different. One crazy thing about glazing in ceramics is that you have to imagine what this thing is gonna look like after these materials melt, because right now they look really weird, okay? But when they melt, they're gonna turn into a specific color that we saw on our test tiles that we can see on that wall while we're in here, okay? But do some studying, think about what colors you maybe wanna use. Hopefully we'll still have all of those when you come in. And we're gonna glaze our objects, okay? We're gonna be quick about the way we glaze our objects, because we're gonna probably, Sam and I haven't decided quite yet, but we're probably gonna have, you know, kind of 20 or 30-minute time slots for people to be able to come in, and we're only gonna be able to have 4 humans inside of the studio, or inside of the glaze area at one point in time, all right? So that's glazing.